Hello. Today we'll talk about botanicals, health, and well-being. So why do plants make so many bioactive natural products or secondary metabolites, as we call them, or phytochemicals, while animals do not? Well, the answer is rather simple. Those different groups of organisms have very different ways they respond to their environment. Animals are mobile, and therefore they spend their energy into protecting themselves and communicating via making sounds or making motions. This is where energy, which animals accumulate from eating plant, goes to. Plants, on the other hand, are sessile organisms. They're basically anchored in place by their roots. They cannot run away. So everything they do, everything about plant business and their daily survival, their daily life, is based on chemistry. They defend themselves from pathogens, from herbivores, by making toxic compounds, toxic to the animals which try to eat them or diseases which try to attack them. And they communicate and acquire nutrients, also using a vast array of chemicals. And they put the energy they receive from suns, not into running away or movement or speech, but into chemical synthesis. There are three major classes of phytochemicals which plant can synthesize, which are best known as beneficial compounds for human health. Probably the largest and most diverse group of those compounds are called alkaloids, and we will talk about all those groups in the subsequent lectures. Alkaloids are characterized by at least one nitrogen atom in their structure. Otherwise, they can be very diverse and use different biosynthetic pathways for their synthesis. Morphine, for example, or nicotine are the examples of plant alkaloids which can affect human health. Phenolics, they do not have nitrogen in their structure, and they contain at least one hydroxyl group which is attached to aromatic or benzyl ring. Those compounds, again, are very diverse. They can be small molecular weight, like salicylic acid, or very large molecular weight polymeric structures, which, for example, form tannins in the bark of many plants. Their function is also defense, but also they can harvest photosynthetically beneficial energy, for example, and contribute to the process of photosynthesis, or they can absorb deleterious ultraviolet light, for example, therefore protecting plant cells from damage which ultraviolet light can cause. Terpenoids, they are biosynthetically derived from a simple 5-carbon compound called isoprene. So the isoprenoids is another name they often called. Also can be very large or very small molecular weight-wise. Taxol, for example, is a very good example of terpenoid, which became a very important anti-cancer drug. So now let's talk about different regulatory classifications of botanicals, which are at least used in the United States. Different countries in the world may use somewhat different systems, but I can tell you what normally the botanicals go to in the United States, and then other countries will be similar. By far best known category probably is regular drugs, pharmaceuticals, known as NCE, new chemical entities. Those are the pills which we swallow, sometimes injections which we receive. And bioactive is usually one single compound. It can be directly extracted from plants, for example, like artemisinin, like morphine, or synthesized through synthetic chemistry. Taxol, aspirin, artemisinin, and many of those examples of single ingredient drugs, which are based on plant ingredients. We'll talk about it later. And they have to go through the very extensive process of being approved by FDA, which is Federal Drug Administration in the US. Again, through preclinical work and clinical trial. Very costly, very lengthy process. But as a result, you get a right to actually deliver those beneficial compounds, for example, from plants, using prescription medication route. The regular drugs, NCEs, are based on a single bioactive molecules. What we are going to be mostly interested in, though, in the course of those lectures and in the future, is products, botanical therapeutics, which are based on mixtures. They're not pure compound like NCE drugs, but they're multi-component botanicals. And those, again, can be regulatorily rooted into different categories. One of those categories is called botanical drugs, because actually in the US now, since 1994, you can theoretically apply for the registration of a drug through FDA, even if it's a mixture of different compounds, even if it's not a pure compound but a plant extract. Very few of those have been approved. Verigen, which is a green tea extract, is approved for warts, usually genital warts. And crofelemer, which is found from Crotonus sangre de drago tree grown in South America, has a very narrow label application for HIV/AIDS associated diarrhea. Category which is probably very relevant to our course are dietary supplements and nutraceuticals. Those are extracts, they're botanical extracts, which always contain mixtures of compounds from plants. We'll talk about them later much more extensively. They don't require such a rigorous regulatory route and to be registered, to be marketed in the United States. We'll talk about the pre-market FDA notification, or they have to have a history of human use, and they can be sold much faster than normally the drugs need to be developed. Garlic, echinacea, ginseng, many examples of dietary supplements or botanical nutraceuticals. Then the GRAS ingredient. GRAS stands for generally recognized as safe. These are rigorously tested botanicals, usually against single molecules or a group of related molecules which come from plants, which can be used as food additives. They can actually be added to food, and therefore they're GRAS. They have to be very rigorously proven safe. But if you get that GRAS certification, your botanical extract or single compound from plant can be used in food. Phytosterols like Benecol or 3-omega fatty acids probably are our best known GRAS ingredients, which are used added to foods for the purposes of making them healthier. Medical foods is a very obscure category. Basically, you are allowed to correct certain nutritional deficiencies if they're associated with specific diseases only under the supervision of the physician. Limbrel, Oxona, those are usually for the joint diseases associated with certain nutritional deficiencies, can be used as targets for medical foods as long as they're prescribed by a physician and supervised by the physician. Functional foods, very interesting, very large category, billions of dollars. We'll talk about that market. Foods with health benefits which go beyond the nutritional benefits. And you can actually get a health claim on certain foods as long as you can medically prove that it's beneficial. For example, oatmeal for lowering cholesterol, cranberry juice for urinary tract infections, for example, although this has really very dubious claim and we're not sure whether it does anything or not, but those are examples of medical foods. Lastly, but certainly very importantly, cosmeceuticals. Many botanicals added to cosmetic products. They're not supposedly be used to improve health, but to maintain beauty and wellness. They usually labeled as anti-wrinkle, anti-aging, skin whitening. This is how they can be marketed, with purely cosmetic type claims. Very important market, major market, very easy to put those compounds on the market, as we'll talk later. That route is very fast. And responsibility for safety really lies with the manufacturer. So this slide tells us where those phytochemicals, which comprise medications, prescription drugs, for example, we use today, where do they come from? And this is an interesting statistical slide which compiles information from many different sources. Clearly, what we now understand that most of the compounds used for treating and preventing diseases come from regions of the world which are the most biodiverse. Therefore, they are mainly tropical regions which have significant amount of precipitations, and this is what the rainforest is. Rainforest, tropical forests occupy only 7% of the land, yet they contain an enormous biodiversity, diversity of plant species. They contain at least 75% of all 250,000, quarter of a million, or probably more now, close to 300,000 species of higher plants, which we know about. Just 1 acre of tropical forest, whether it's in Ecuador, whether it's in Congo, whether it's in Indonesia, can contain over 1,000 plant species. And those are millions of chemical compounds which we just walk on when we wander into the tropical forest. So many different plant species, and many of them still unidentified, and certainly many of those compounds have never even been isolated or structurally characterized. So plants from tropical forests have produced 47, at least 47 major pharmaceutical drugs. Again, we will talk about them, give you some example in different slides, different lectures. Plants from temperate regions, for example, where I live now, New Jersey, produced fewer major drugs, still about 20. Obviously, Taxol comes from the temperate forest of Western United States. And I think what is very important to realize is the last frontier and very unexplored from the point of view of phytochemistry frontier is the oceans, which comprise 2/3 of the world's surface, of course, are the oceans. Many different plant lives which are present in the oceans, and yet those are the higher plants and lower plants. They contain enormous species diversity. They control, as we're starting to understand, they contain very high phytochemical diversity. Yes, and yet the marine plants are much less explored than terrestrial plants. So this is something quite interesting to remember. Two great scientists who work for National Cancer Institute in their natural product branch, Gordon Craig and Dave Newman, have spent significant amount of time cataloging all the single entity drugs, NCE drugs, which came on the market worldwide, and looked at the sources of the bioactive compounds which became active ingredients of those drugs, with the purpose of determining how many of those are actually based on natural products. Not necessarily plant natural products, but natural products. And they published a series of papers. The last, I believe, was published in 2014. And very interestingly, what it shows, and if you look at the top graph there, they show the percentage of NCE-based drugs which have been approved, which came from natural products. And what you see from this top diagram is that despite the fact that the interest in natural products and certainly screening of natural products have been declining over the last 20 years or so, the number of NCE drugs which come out of natural products or based on natural products or inspired by natural products have basically remained constant. And the bottom diagram here, blue line, actually shows a number of small molecule-based drugs which have been approved each year. And as you actually see, because of the biologics, certainly this number has not been increasing because biologics take over greater and greater proportion of the pharmaceutical markets. So the number of drugs which come to the market, single entity chemical drugs, remains about the same over the years, and many of them still come from nature. So nature is still a good source for drug discovery. Now, the next slide demonstrates the result of analysis done by Coyne and Carter in 2005, where they actually looked at the total number of patents from small molecules which have been filed or issued each year. And they tried to determine what portion of those patents are actually based on medicinal natural products. This is shown in orange bars versus light brown bars, which is a total number of patents. And as you see from this slide, over a substantial length of time, and despite the diminishing interest in natural products as sources of drug discovery, still the number of patented molecules, patented for drug uses, have remained relatively constant, which again confirms the importance of nature as a continuous source of novel bioactive molecules on the way of becoming drugs. Well, until at least the COVID-19 pandemic, when we see the development of vaccine within 1 year, normally the traditional drug discovery process is very long and very expensive. It takes over 10 years normally, and it starts with screening of thousands, 10 to 20 thousands of compounds, identifying the lead, going through preclinical work. It takes at least 1, 2, 3, or 4 years. Phase 1 clinical studies, phase 2 clinical studies, which significant length. Phase 3 clinical studies, much larger group of patients. Again, we'll talk about all this later on. Filing for FDA approval, receiving the FDA approval, that can take over 10 years easily. As you can see, this is again just for general educational purposes from this slide, the pharmaceutical research and development costs have been escalating year after year. This is shown on the left diagram. And yet the efficiency of discovering the new chemical entity drugs have been declining, which is shown on the right diagram. This truly indicates that it takes more and more money to get a new beneficial drug which has been registered by FDA. So why are natural products and phytochemicals from plants are not as popular today as they were earlier in history of humanity as sources of health, as sources of new drugs? And the answer to that lies in the fact that there are many competing technologies which enable people to discover new molecules or to synthesize new molecules, because humans started to play God with nature. Now we can make molecules in the lab. 10,000 years ago, the only way we can test different molecules would be by trying to eat the particular certain plant and see whether it has any effect. We did make many chemicals ourselves. Synthetic chemistry, which appeared 100, 150 years ago, gave us the power to make nature, to make matter, to make molecules. And we use it very effectively to widen the assortment of the molecules we can test as new drugs. 30, 40 years ago, then combinatorial chemistry was invented. That increased the number of molecules we can actually make in the lab, make synthetically, by at least an order of magnitudes. Tens of thousands of molecules could be now made in a test tube. We slowly build the computer power, which enables us to actually model the target side, the receptor side of the molecules of pharmacological targets, whether it's an enzyme, neurotransmitters, or whatever we believe is a molecular target we are interested in. And through the process of computer assisted docking, design a molecule which will fit that specific target, which can actually molecularly interact with a particular receptor. We could design drugs rationally, not just through blind testing. And of course, and we'll talk about it much more, The frontier of modern pharmacological science and a new drug discovery is in biologics, in vaccines, in recombinant proteins. This is where it's all going. And I think it will be very difficult in the future to reestablish the role of natural products as a primary source for the discovery and development of new drugs. So let's now look at the health and wellness opportunities for botanicals as a function of potential market applications. Let's start with pharmaceuticals. Because this is by far the largest total market for botanicals, and if quarter of all pharmaceutical agents come from plants, then this market is roughly $250 million, at least in 2016. It's larger now. What is the problem of targeting botanicals as new drugs? It's time to the market, cost to develop them, and enormous regulatory burden to prove to the regulatory agencies that it is safe and effective. Second largest commercial opportunity is functional foods. Again, those foods which deliver more than just nutrition to a person. A very large market based on functional foods which use botanical functional ingredients. Requires somewhat less time, but still very rigorous validation and safety requirements by FDA. Anything which people can eat and consume as food, and any ingredients have to be proven safe beyond reasonable doubt. It's a very high bar and sometimes can be very expensive if you have a new ingredient new botanical ingredient you think can be used in foods. Dietary supplements, although smaller market than functional foods, it represents a great opportunity which since 1994 in the United States became a major industry because the regulatory environment has been changed in 1994. We'll talk about it later. 45 billion probably market in 2017. Less time to market. Actually, you can market a botanical right away as long as it's either been already on the market before 1994, or you can prove to FDA that it's reasonably safe. It doesn't need to be safe beyond reasonable doubt. It just has to be reasonably safe. Very different bar, very different safety criteria. Very easier to fulfill. Cosmetics, botanical ingredients, inexpensive to put on the market. Almost no safety requirements are needed to be satisfied. They're not really regulated by the government. It's a responsibility of a company to show that their cosmetic products are safe. And it is a very interesting opportunity to me for botanicals because there's so little good science done in the cosmetic industry. And yet botanicals clearly can have beneficial effects for skin, aging, as anti-wrinkles, and so forth. Cheap to develop, very fast to put on the market. Very interesting opportunity for botanical products. So single ingredient new chemical entity drugs are relatively easy to quality control because all you have to validate is the presence of a particular compound, which is an active ingredient. It's usually present in a very high amount. It's very easy to quantify and make sure that you have what is called batch-to-batch consistency every time you manufacture a new shipment of your drug. However, for multi-component botanicals, although the regulatory FDA type requirements may be much less, particularly if they enter a dietary supplement or cosmetic route, the challenges of standardization, validation, batch-to-batch consistency are much greater because they are such a complex mixture. And in many cases, for example, for dietary supplements and maybe even functional foods, we don't even know exactly what the active is because the ultimate efficacy is based on an interplay of potentially additive or synergistic effects between several different phytochemicals, which can be all active and acting together. So it is much harder to standardize and validate those mixtures. And this is a big challenge for future science. And it is also what general public and regulatory agencies feel is a problem with multi-component botanicals. It's just hard to make sure every time you harvest a plant, you extract it, you process it, you formulate it, that you get exactly the same composition of phytochemicals. It is also very difficult to establish what is the function, what is actually the active ingredient in the mixture. Because you start to fractionate it, and very often you don't come up with a single compound because the activity is based on a combination of several compounds. And we also, ideally, if we try to have a high quality research and development activity, you want to understand the mode of action of why is that your multi-component botanical acts in a particular way. What is the molecular target? This is almost essential for drugs to really understand mode of action if you want to register it. And it certainly is much harder for multi-component botanicals. And finally, manufacturing. Extracts can come from China, they can come from India, they can come from Canada, they can come from Europe. Every time we extract plants, we can different composition, which is not the case for single ingredient drugs, because every time we make a molecule, we can easily say that this is what we made, is the same molecule, there's nothing else there. And that opens the possibility for very unfortunate, unscrupulous adulteration of many botanical extracts with something else, whether it's cheaper plant, whether it's a drug to increase the efficiency or some synthetic chemical. In many cases, we'll talk about it later on, have been discovered. And it's easier to hide the contaminants, whether they're heavy metals, which is a problem for many multi-component botanicals, because plants are grown in the conditions where soil, water, or soils have a lot of heavy metals in them, or, for example, pesticide residues, because many of the source plants require pesticides to grow. So reading the future, reading the leaves, we can ask ourselves, based on what we just heard and what we learned from others, what is the future of plant natural products in human health? Is that single ingredient drugs? Well, probably not as much. I think you should think wellness and disease prevention and beauty. And the delivery vehicles for botanicals for those purposes, probably the ones which enjoy significant growth in the future and acceptance by general public and regulators, will be functional foods, dietary supplements, and consumer and cosmetic products. Again, we'll talk about it more. Some of the ones which actually come from our laboratory are shown in the pictures, but they're functional food like our super lettuces, dietary supplements like some of our products, extracts for women's health, or cosmetic products used by Estee Lauder. And finally, in this lecture, I would like to talk to you about the Convention on Biological Diversity, which is an example of how really good intentions can bring you to rather unfortunate and unexpected results. Conventional biological diversity was signed by about 160 countries in 1992 in Rio de Janeiro. The reason why conventional biological diversity became so important is because it changed the ownership of biodiversity, changed the ownership of genetic resources present in the country, within the borders of each country. Before 1992, it was often considered as a common heritage of mankind, and anybody can go and collect plants from Brazil, from Australia, from Ecuador, or Peru. This is what was reversed by CBD, or Convention on Biological Diversity, because that convention, signed and agreed on by a great majority of the countries, now gave the ownership of biodiversity and biological resources within the borders, geographical borders of the country, to that particular country. And the only way now you can actually go and collect plants or microbes or animals from the territory would be if you get two very important things straightened out and actually signed. Everybody who is involved, who lives in this country and who owns those property or immediately shares some even knowledge about medicinal plants, for example, have to sign the informed consent and allow you to collect actual plants or the ethnobotanical information which exists about them. So you have to inform the people who are a custodian of each particular area. It can be government, it can be tribal leaders, it can be communities, whatever. Each country has its own rules. And because the intent for collection of many biological resources was to develop them into commercial product, the CBD required you to obtain the legally binding benefit sharing agreement, which means, if a product is developed, part of the benefits will go to the owners of the biodiversity from which this particular chemical or natural product has been isolated. It's a great idea, which many of us strongly support. But unfortunately, what happened with this idea is that a lot of people, because of the bureaucratic difficulties, which now suddenly became associated with study and collection of biodiversity for natural products, a lot of companies gave up, a lot of scientists gave up. It became very difficult to sign those agreements because now suddenly it's not the scientists who control this and local people, but usually the bureaucrats and administrators, and it became very, very cumbersome process to go anywhere in the world to collect the material. So the idea is great, yes, share with people who own it. If you use their knowledge, you have to pay them back, equitable percent of whatever profits you get. But in reality, after CBD was signed, the bioexploration of the world have really slowed down just because of the legal and bureaucratic difficulties. So this is all I can tell you. And that contributed to the relative decline in interest in natural product-based product development. I would like to finish with lecture with a plea for conservation of all biological resources of this world, specifically plant resources. Civilization is going through the mass species extinction now, as we know, because of anthropogenic factors, because of us, people, destroying our environment, cutting down our forests, plowing our meadows, savannas, and overfishing and overexploiting our oceans. The picture below here is the one I took just last year in Borneo, and it was very sad to see one of the richest biodiversity, richest parts of the world, rainforest in Borneo, being cut down for timber, being cut down for land to grow oil palms. It was really sad to go down the rivers and just watch trees being converted into lumber. As a result, out of about 300,000 species of flowering plants still in existence, 1 in 12 are now considered endangered. And with disappearance of those species, will forever lose the biochemical resources, those wonderful molecules we've never even isolated or characterized, which will be gone to extinction with the disappearance of the species which can make those materials. So please, as much as you can, help in this mission of conserving biological resources, conserving this wonderful biochemical capacity of plants, because many of those molecules which are going to be gone soon may actually be a wonderful life-saving drugs of the future.